Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the latest and last discussions from Drinko Hall in 2020. We hope you found these conversations thought-provoking and worthwhile. Our intent with discussions from Drinko Hall is to create a community of lifelong learners among our law school alumni and friends while we showcase the scholarship and expertise of our distinguished faculty. In the past 6 months, we've tackled issues such as COVID and the law, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and cases reviewed by and previewed in the coming term or the current term of the U.S. Supreme Court. However, we'd be remiss if we did not highlight this monumental election year in our educational series. Titled Election Reflections, who better to give us insight into all the intricacies of the election, from the changes in voting brought about by the pandemic to the record number of election-related lawsuits, and the faculty from our very own Election Law at Ohio State program, as well as Ohio's Director of Elections, whom we are proud to claim as one of our own College of Law alums. Our 4 panelists were laser focused on the intricacies of this unprecedented election long before the rest of us became election experts over the past few weeks, and we're eager to learn from them today. It's my privilege to introduce my colleagues, Ned Foley, Director of Election Law at Ohio State, and the Charles W. Ebersold and Florence Whitcomb Ebersold Chair in Constitutional Law. Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of Election Law and the C. William O'Neill Professor in Law and Judicial Administration. And Terry Enns, Senior Fellow for Election Law and Clinical Professor of Law. We also welcome our special guest and 2016 Moritz alum, Amanda Grandjean. Mandy is the Director of Elections and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose. She, of course, has unique and in-depth perspective on how voting was handled in Ohio this year. So before we begin, a little housekeeping. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature throughout the program, as we'll have allotted a large portion of today's programming for audience participation. We also want to answer questions you may have and allow our experts to weigh in on these complex issues. With that, let's begin. Mandy, my first question is for you. It's obviously been a wild couple of weeks, and I'm just wondering, how are you? Getting any sleep?
Yes, thank you for asking. I did sleep in my office for a couple days last week. I had a nice cozy blow-up mattress and made it quite a home. Yes, the sleep is coming, but the prep work that we did over the last 2 years and then really over the last 7 months in light of the global pandemic that we're all living through has been intense, but it has been really good and really fruitful, and we're very proud of the work that the 88 county boards of elections did to make this election such a success, even with all of the adversity that we faced as a nation and as a state, especially with everything that occurred in March and everything that we did throughout the last 8 months to make sure that November 3rd and really the 28 days preceding November 3rd and the early vote period was the safest, most secure, accessible, and accurate election that Ohio has ever seen. And so we're really proud to say mission accomplished there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a critical function your office holds and administers. So just wonderful to hear you say how proud you are of how things went. And it may be premature to ask you to reflect on the administration of the election in Ohio overall, especially given that counties may be still processing some absentee ballots and that absentee ballots postmarked by November 2nd, as well as ballots for military and overseas voters can still be received up until tomorrow. But I'm wondering if you can think back to just a few months ago preparing for this election and give us a sense of what some of those plans were and how you felt they were carried out and how everything went.
Absolutely. So the pandemic, of course, changed everything. And it feels like just yesterday, it was 2014 and I'm sitting in Professor Foley's classroom on disputed elections. And then in 2015, I was the symposium editor for OSLJ, and we were together planning the election law symposium. So it's kind of this surreal moment for me to see it all come full circle. And so to all of the law students that are listening to this, you have the best of the best. You should be really proud to be a Buckeye, and you should be really proud to be able to learn from these people who I hold so much respect for, and clearly the nation holds so much respect for. So you know what, our rankings better go up for this, is all I have to say. But no, I shameless plug. I mean, truly, this is the best law school, and I'm, completely biased, but I remember talking to Professor Foley after everything in March and just saying, what do you think about this? Picking his brain. And same with Steve Huffner and Terry. When I brought in my colleagues, it seems like forever ago, in November of 19, when the chief election official in Wisconsin and Kentucky and I came in and said, hey, we want to get together with the election law program and see what we can do to have nationwide conversations on improving election laws throughout the country. And then boom, pandemic. And all of our focus very quickly shifted to administering, the most consequential election of our time under extreme circumstances, and a climate nationally that is, intense seems to be the understatement of a century, but is incredibly intense. And the pressure that, us as statewide election officials feel, and, that Secretary LaRose, of course, feels. He's a Green Beret, so, he is super used to dealing with very intense situations and operating under a lot of pressure, but our 88 county boards of elections too, because they're the ones that are on the ground actually administering the election to all Ohio voters. So we had to, after March, quickly shift to what do we need to do to get ready for October 6th, right? Because while the election is actually November 3rd, in Ohio, we have 28 days of early voting. So it's actually an election month. So we, under Secretary LaRose's amazing leadership, immediately formed what we refer to as the Ready for November Task Force. And Professor Foley was actually a guest on that. We brought in nationwide leaders from all over, including Cedar Point and Cedar Fair, to talk about line management. I mean, we were bringing in experts at every step of the process. The CDC, we wrote, I am not a doctor. I disclaim I'm a lawyer, like I'm an election law lawyer. We brought in people from ODH, and we wrote these guidelines for all the county boards of elections on what the requirements were, how to set up their polling locations. And that was all, really came together through the Ready for November task force that consisted of local election officials, the secretary, and then special guests that we would bring. And it was all streamed on the Ohio channel. So you can actually watch that it's still up there. But we came up with these ideas, and I'm, ferociously writing notes, because I know that the second that each task force is over, I'm going to have to go figure out how to implement all of the ideas and get all the ideas ready and our team ready for this. But it was the best thing I think we ever did, was that task force to show also all Ohioans that we were taking this so seriously. We were taking all of the prep so seriously. And we were taking everything that not only the public and voters had to say, but also the boards of elections into consideration when we were making major policy decisions that impacted 11 million Ohioans and over 8 million registered voters. So the Ready for November task force was critical. Our health guidance for the boards of elections was critical. We had to come up with a mask policy that was not only constitutional, but also protected election officials, voters, and everyone that was in and around a voting location. So the legal issues that we were dealing with on a secondly basis were massive. But it was great, and I was lucky to have the training from the best of the best to be able to handle those. So the prep for Ready for November, the health guidance, the CARES directive. So this is Directive 2020-11 that the secretary issued, was the secretary's vision for what the boards needed and were required to do with our CARES dollars from the federal government to implement and administer a successful election in the fall. And that's probably one of the things that I'm most proudest of is that directive, because it really tried to think of every single emergency situation that would have happened and what the boards needed to prepare for that. So we talked about, Professor Foley coined this term, flattening the absentee curve, right? And so we really wanted to think about how do we know that absentee ballots are going to be massive, right? Unlike any other election, people are going to be requesting absentee ballots and voting by mail. How do we take that pressure off of election officials? Well, our messaging needs to be request your absentee ballot now. We don't care if it's August, request it now so the boards can do all the prep work and get you your ballot as soon as October 6th hits. And that's exactly what happened. And it was so cool to see so many of our counties, I had voters calling me on later on the 6th and on the 7th saying, I already got my absentee ballot. And I'm like, that's exactly how, we wanted this to work. And same with Franklin County. I'm sure some of you heard on election day, there was an issue with uploading voter history to their e-poll books. Well, in our CARES directive, we required every single Board of Elections to have paper poll book backups so that it was a seamless failover. If there were an issue with e-poll books, that they could immediately go to paper and continue the voting process. So we tried to simulate tabletop and talk about disaster scenarios at every step of the way, all layered with a global pandemic on top of it. And then thinking, I remember being, in several other conversations from a legal side of what are the disaster scenarios on a legal side. So every single day, second that I would wake up and go to bed, which is very little sleep over the past 2 years, but definitely from the last 8 months, was what are the known knowns, what are the unknown unknowns, and what are the known unknowns, right? Those 3 categories of things. What can I control? What do I not have control over? And what am I missing? What is the dancing bear to all of this? The Harvard Belfer Center, has this video where it's like, can you see the dancing bear and a bunch of people throwing basketballs? And it's, what am I missing and how do I prepare for that? And so this election was a perfect example from an election administration perspective that we really tried to prepare for everything. And I think we were, ultimately successful for that. Other than the fact that this was maybe the week before the election, I said, has anybody reached out to NASA? I think I need a briefing from NASA on this alleged asteroid. I haven't had a report on the asteroid. So that was, one dancing bear that I wasn't quite sure of, but I hadn't seen any reports. But overall, super proud, so proud to work and serve under Secretary LaRose and more importantly, so proud to serve all of Ohio voters because, with record turnout in a global pandemic, that just makes my heart so happy. We were able to, implement insane security upgrades and combat foreign influence and mis and disinformation all along the way. And I'm so proud of what Ohio was able to accomplish during the last 8 months.
Yeah, and we're so incredibly proud of you for helping us as a state have such a tremendous success story, asteroid or not. So thanks so much, Mandy. Let me turn for just a few moments to some of our faculty members, and then we'll have lots of time for audience participation and questions. So Professor Huffner, let me turn to you and maybe ask the same question I asked of Mandy, but at the national level, considering what you were worried about coming into the election several months out, how do you think things went at a national perspective in terms of administration?
Sure. Thanks, Dean Davies. Well, I think nationally, election administrators should feel proud and relaxed and relieved about how things have gone overall. I think across the country, people were, in ways analogous to what Mandy described, working to be as prepared as they could, both because this is a presidential election year with extra stress, then the pandemic overlaid on top of that. So, people were people were nervous and people were working hard to make sure we were well prepared. And I think election day and election month, almost everywhere went really smoothly. We did not end up with problems at the polls. We did not end up with major problems with the way in which absentee mail-in ballots were processed. We did not have election day hacking problems, which is always now a worry that we're working hard to reduce the risks of. I mean, Mandy mentioned the way in which here in Ohio, we were backstopped for the electronic poll book issue. To the extent there is a way in which something that we saw coming down the pike months and months ago, in fact, still was problematic, it was that Pennsylvania refused to change its law ahead of time so that their mail-in ballots could be pre-processed before election day. And they didn't start the processing of all their mail-in ballots till election day. And then it took them days to finish that. And many people were urging them to make a change in their state law so that they could have an overall election that would look smoother, and they did not do that. Today, we're seeing litigation in places, not because there was necessarily a defect though in their process. It's simply because those are the states where things are close. And let me leave it there for now. We can pick up any of those themes more when we do the question and answer.
Great, thanks so much. So Professor Enns, let me turn to you. Obviously, seeing some of the changes and adaptations, and we heard about some of them from Ms. Grandjean in terms of how states have adapted new innovations they've had to use to accommodate the pandemic and other changes. Are there lessons learned that you think should be adopted on a permanent basis going forward in elections to make them safer, healthier, more robust, and secure?
So one of the obvious things that was different this election was the massively increased use of mail ballots. Now, mail ballots are not new. Many states have had them available for certain kinds of voters or all voters, in the past. So nobody should think this is a new thing. We've been doing it for a long time. But the percentage of voters who use mail ballots really went up exponentially because of feeling that it's safer than going in person during a pandemic. And I think the part of the problem is our infrastructure hasn't really caught up. We didn't, as Steve mentioned, some of the changes we didn't get made in advance of the election. And I think some of those things are what going forward we're going to need to look at. Obviously, the healthier an election, a healthy election depends on having the rules of the game set out before the election. And so now is the time when we should be looking at those things. And related to mail ballots, we need to clarify more about how to drop off mail ballots if you don't want to put them in the mail. Where those boxes can be, how many can be located, how to make sure they're safe. Another thing is return by dates. We have them, they need to be clear and they need to be understood by people. And there's a lot of variation throughout the states and people need to understand that. Signature matching, there's been litigation over all of these issues. And who has the skill to look at signatures and how signatures change over time and what that means. And so again, I think going forward, we need to look at those rules and try to get them established. And one of the things that I was thinking about is that maybe we want to have a little bit more national oversight over the things that depend on national behavior. So for example, I like the fact that we have 50 different state systems because it's a really safer way to run our elections. It's pretty hard to hack into all 50 states and get them to go your way. So I like that. And our decentralized process responds to local needs and to local traditions. But at a certain point, if we're relying on a national system like the post office, maybe we should set some national minimums that respond to the needs created by the elector doing everything properly. And now I give it over to the postal system, which is a national system, and then I don't know what happens. So it may be that we should think about like a minimum number of days that the post office has to get mailed ballots to election officials, things like that. We might want to think about going ahead. But most importantly is we get the rules set before election day, not during and after election day.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Terry. Professor Foley, let me turn to you for one last question of our panelists before we get into the Q&A with the audience, because I definitely want to make sure we have time to have that discussion with everyone participating here. Obviously, you're serving at a national level, both here at Ohio State, but also commenting for NBC News on election law, as well as new relationship you have in terms of writing op-eds for the Washington Post. I know you're watching closely some of the legal challenges that are occurring and some of the challenges in terms of the presidential election. I invite you to weigh in on that and tell us sort of where you think things stand and where they may head going forward.
Sure, thanks. And I want to thank Mandy for her kind words and put them right back to her, because, you know, one of the things that's most rewarding for being a professor is to watch students blossom and flourish. And, you know, obviously we're just so proud of Mandy and what she's done with her education and what she's doing in terms of public service. We like to think, as you all know, that our mission at Ohio State is public service as a public university. And Mandy's certainly carrying that tradition on out in another way of doing public service. So, so I just, you know, as a professor, as a mentor, I'm just so proud and delighted. So wanted to share that. You know, I think Steve, you know, touched on this a little bit. I mean, I feel pretty good about our legal system in terms of the mechanics. I mean, there are definitely ways that we can change our legal system for the better, including litigation over the results of elections. I mean, you know, don't get me started. I've got a long list of things. But as we've said so far, you know, the process has gone remarkably well, both in the casting of votes. And I'm confident that the legal system can handle all the current lawsuits that are pending now and achieve correct results on behalf of the voters of the country in each of the states where this is happening, based on principles of law and evidence that's put before the courts. I don't see any reasons that we doubt the basic rule of law orientation of our legal system. You know, we could talk more details about that. I think the concern that we have to be honest about at the moment is what's going on that's you know, broader than just the legal system in the nation's processing of the election, its results and the processes. And you know, I think that's a hard conversation that we're having as a country right now, probably because a lot of the conversations are siloed the way much of our you know, of our conversations are in polarization. I'm wondering, you know, whether Ohio can be something of you know, Terry talked about the laboratories of democracy at the state level. You know, our civic culture in Ohio tends to be, I think, more civic minded maybe than some. We have our issues of polarization and contestation, but as Buckeyes, we have a strong allegiance to being Buckeyes. And one thing I do want to say, because this has been very important for me to watch, you know, in other times in other states, sometimes those in charge of elections have often wanted to use the process for the advantage of incumbency or the advantage of partisanship. That has not happened in Ohio. And if it were happening, I would call it out. I have called it out in the past. I've called it out in other states, but I am confident and proud in saying that the stewardship of the electoral process here in Ohio was undertaken for the benefit of the you know, the voters and the electoral system in Ohio. You know, obviously, public officials who are elected have party affiliations, but there is the capacity of public servants to act in the public interest and to put country or society above raw partisan power grabbing kind of behavior that can happen. And we should be very proud in Ohio that we have kind of done this the right way with the right values, because values are crucially important on this. You know, we can have rules and procedures, but ultimately to make democracy work, it's about values and norms and culture. There has to be, there was James Kloppenberg, who's a historian at Harvard, was quoted in an article in the New York Times yesterday And he used the term reciprocity. I like to use the term fair play. I think it means the same thing. I mean, in a competitive election, you're going to have two parties at least fighting ferociously to win. They're entitled to be competitive. We know in Ohio, we know what it's like to compete on the football field, in any venture, but we believe, I hope we believe in fair competition. I know that the Secretary of State's office has run this election with the value of fair competition. The challenge for America right now is whether the country as a whole can uphold that value of fair competition. It's an evolving process. I think I wrote in an opinion piece earlier this week. One of the reasons why I think this conversation is hard is because there are two truths about our election system in the effort to achieve finality. And they're different truths, and we have a hard time combining them. So we have one system which is built around the networks projecting winners and losing candidates usually conceding defeat just based on the network projections, and the winning candidates then declaring victory based on the fact that the losing candidates conceded. All of that happens often on election night, maybe the next morning. All of that happens prematurely relative to the legal process. As we all have been talking about, the legal process takes time. It's still going on. And so, I'm perfectly comfortable referring to President-elect Biden as President-elect Biden. But when I say that, I'm saying that based on the cultural truth, as I see it, of how the process works, and other politicians reacted to that. As a legal proposition, it is also, to be honestly true, we do not have a president-elect yet. We can't have a president-elect yet until we have the Electoral College meet in mid-December. And then actually Congress officially declares the president-elect on January 6th, because Congress under the Constitution has that role. But we're impatient as Americans. We don't want to wait till January 6th to say we have a president-elect. There are these issues of transitions as a practical matter, national security, all the things you've been hearing about the news. So, we have to be able to run our elections that meet the cultural needs of our society as well as the legal apparatus, because that's what gives us official winners. And, we're struggling with that, I think it's fair to say, this year. I'm hoping that the struggle does not cause irreparable damage to these ideas of fair play and reciprocity, and that we can, because the dust hasn't settled yet. And I'm hoping that when it does settle, we can look back and say, you know what, we actually, it was a little bit of a roller coaster ride. It was, but in the end, we did come around with the idea that there was a winner and that both sides could actually recognize that the winner was the winner, and authentically so. We're not there yet, but I do hope we get there. Great.
Thanks so much, Ned. So I want to make sure we turn to the Q&A from the audience and encourage you, if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A using your dialogue box. Happy to pose those questions to our panelists. So I'm going to turn back to you first, Mandy, if that's all right. There's a question that's come in from the audience about what is your response to evidence coming out regarding discarded votes, switched votes, dead people voting, machine glitches, all of which can call into question the integrity of the system.
I mean, I would say, we do checks in Ohio. We do list maintenance in Ohio. We do fraud checks. We do all of that. But I would really caution the way that we're discussing these things. And to Professor Foley's point, it is so dangerous to be saying that there is rampant fraud in our electoral process when there is no evidence. And I, of course, can only speak for the state of Ohio, when I'm saying this, but there's not evidence of that. And so Secretary LaRose was quoted in the New York Times this week saying the exact same thing. And, it's really dangerous to adopt that narrative because of the degrading that it does to our democratic process and how it actually, deters people from participating. And that's never what we want. But all I can say is we have those safeguards in Ohio. We have many, many, many safeguards in Ohio. And if there is any sort of wrongdoing, or any sort of, fraud, I don't even know what that means, because in 3599, there's a slew of different, criminal offenses that we could refer to as fraud, right? So I think you need to know what you're talking about when you say the word fraud too. And so many people don't, they just throw it around. And so I would just really urge you, be responsible lawyers, be responsible consumers, know what you're talking about before you're just regurgitating something you saw on Twitter. That's not founded in reality necessarily. So I mean, make sure you know what you're saying. If it's about list maintenance, we can certainly have that discussion, but there's not evidence of that in Ohio.
Thanks so much. I mean, it's so enlightening to hear from election officials actually charged with carrying out the system and to hear, on the ground what it's like. Steve, maybe could you talk for just a moment about that same question, challenged votes or votes that might be fraudulent at the national level, and if there's any evidence there?
Sure. I mean, I think Mandy has described what goes on in every state. Every state is incredibly careful and thorough about things like list maintenance and so forth. Does that mean that it's perfect? No. But in terms of the claims of fraud in other states where we actually have litigation, we really don't have evidence of such. We have allegations and we have anecdotal reports that have often been secondhand hearsay or that have been predicated on a misunderstanding that upon actual evidentiary analysis have evaporated. So I think it's fair to say that what is a buzz on Twitter amounts to no evidence of systemic fraud.
Great. Terry, maybe I can turn to you for a minute. There's a question in the Q&A about long lines and whether people's ability to stand in those long lines this year was made possible because there's so much telecommuting and people in a different kind of cadence of life than they would normally have due to the pandemic. Some people have suggested that those long lines are actually a sign of voter suppression, and what might be done going forward to address long lines and the administration of people's ability to vote.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something we need to look at. Long lines do preclude people who are unable to stand, people with more infirmities, that's tough for them. People who have work that doesn't allow them to leave the workplace for a long time, but who want to vote either on election day or in-person early voting. I think the more people get used to using mail, excuse me, it may help those lines go down. But I do think we need to do planning. We need to make sure we have enough local polling places such that the lines don't accrue at any given spot, that it's spread out enough throughout the community. But that does involve recruiting poll workers. And this time, the usual group of poll workers was the group that was most at risk from COVID. So hopefully we can think broadly about some of the options for reducing lines. They are definitely a problem for a lot of people.
Terrific, thanks. So Ned, maybe let's turn back to you for just a moment. There's a couple questions coming in. One about, and I'm going to combine them. One is about the overall likelihood of success on the legal merits of some of the challenges that President Trump is bringing to the current election results. And then secondly, whether there's a path for President Trump to get to 270 that's plausible based on those legal challenges.
Yeah, so the short answer to that is no, certainly not on the litigation that has happened so far in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona. And, I've written that, one of the Washington Post columns that actually went up yesterday sort of touches on that a bit. But you don't have to take just my word for it. Karl Rove in the Wall Street Journal also yesterday posted a piece which he said that in order to overturn, the apparent victory on behalf of President-elect Biden, there would have to be proof of fraud in monumental levels. That we just have. This is not a Florida Bush versus Gore kind of situation, and as Karl Rove said, there's just no evidence of that at this point. It just hasn't been presented. So we ought to again be able to have a nonpartisan or bipartisan or cross-partisan acceptance of the factual reality of the situation. what worry, I mean, elections ultimately depend on math. You know, there's some basic arithmetic involved, and it has to be an evidence-based system, right? And we, you know, it's this pretty simplistic, but we cast votes, and we have to do it with integrity and transparency, and there has to be observation. I think, you know, I have been somewhat concerned about some of the limited observation capacities. Not that that undermines the results of the elections, but I don't think when claims are made that there is inadequate observation, those shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. We should say, is there adequate observation so that everybody knows what's going on? Because ultimately, everybody has to be able to trust the system. And the only way you can really trust it is if you can see it. But once you cast your ballots and you observe the process, you count the votes again in a system of transparency, and then you have to believe the numbers. I mean, yes, we have audits and we have recounts and we verify those numbers, but if we can't accept the numbers, we can't run elections. And to show that this is a nonpartisan point, you know, those of us in Ohio can remember we had a difficult election in 2004. We were the pivotal state. We did have a lot of problems in Ohio with long lines and other things, but the you know, President Bush's re-election victory in Ohio in 2004 was an authentic victory. The people of Ohio chose to re-elect President Bush, and that gave him an electoral college majority. Unfortunately, there were Democrats who sort of refused to accept that, and they believed that Ohio was, you know, stolen or rigged or whatever term you want. There was Rolling Stone published a magazine to that effect that was not evidence-based, that was, you know, fanciful, fictitious, but they published it. And then in Congress, you had a US senator and representatives challenge Ohio's votes without an evidentiary basis for doing so. That was inappropriate, irresponsible in my judgment, and is contributed to, it's not the only reason, for unfortunately this ever escalating toxicity of tit for tat, you know, payback, et cetera, et cetera. We have to get beyond that. So to come back to the second part of the question, you know, if we take, based on what we know now, and again, we always should keep an open mind for new evidence, but based on everything that we know now, if the rule of law is followed, and we decide these matters according to laws as they exist based on evidence presented properly, no, President Trump does not have a path to 270 at all. You know, right now it's looking like President-elect Biden's going to get 306 electoral votes, which happens to be the amount that President Trump earned. And I say earned because President Trump did win the 2016 election. He won it fair and square. And Democrats have sometimes had a hard time recognizing that as well. But elections have winners and losers. And you know, that's inevitable. And the losing side has to acknowledge the legitimacy of the voter's choice when the voter chooses the other side. Now we have the electoral college process for doing that. We don't have an overall national popular vote. We could debate about whether that's a good system for the future, but President Trump won the relevant states in 2016. And it appears based on all the evidence now that President-elect Biden has won enough relevant states in 2020. And I think if the rule of law is allowed to play out, it's going to reach that conclusion in a pretty straightforward fashion. And if that doesn't end up being the conclusion, it will be because the rule of law derailed somehow, or some new evidence that is just not in existence at the moment comes forward.
Great. Okay, so Steve, I want to turn back to you. There's a couple of questions coming in about the recount in Georgia, and I'm wondering if you can just talk to us about what we should expect from that recount in terms of how it's carried out, what the timing will be, and also why are they doing it by hand rather than rescanning ballots?
So we've reached a point in our country today in terms of the mechanics of our electoral systems where hand recounts are actually not that advantageous overall. Now, in Florida in 2000, we had a hand recount of some of the Florida counties because the punch card ballots were not always read by the machine readers completely. And there were other, and I could go into more detail about that. But today, when we vote either on a touchscreen machine or with an optical scan ballot, those are pretty accurately counted by the machines. And in fact, when you do a hand recount, you're likely to get small deviations from the machine count. And it may be that the hand count is in fact less accurate than the machine count. Now, there's still some value in doing a hand count, especially if it's to just double check that the software in the touchscreen machines or even in the optical scan ballot readers is accurately capturing what the voter intent as expressed on the paper audit trail, on a touchscreen machine, or on the optical scan paper ballot that the voter has filled out actually matches the electronic total. But you can capture that too just by doing partial hand recounts or audits, and that will identify if there are any problems in the software. So why do we do a hand recount? Well, there are still places where a hand recount is called for. That's not what's happening in Georgia, as I understand it. There, the Secretary of State has called for a hand recount because, frankly, I think in the eyes of the public, it's seen as somehow more thorough and more reliable. And he's feeling some pressure to show that the results that preliminarily have been reported there are the actual final results. Now, I would expect that the actual results from the hand recount will be slightly different. That always happens when you do a recount. But to get to the other part of your question, Dean Davies, recounts today usually do not change the final results by more than a couple of hundred votes. That's about the extent to which you can expect a recount to deviate from the original tallies.
Great, thanks so much. So more questions coming in about, of course, the presidential election, I think understandably so, and some of the challenges. I want to turn back to those in just a moment, but before we do that, I want to ask a couple of other questions that have come in about administration of elections. And the first one will be for you, Mandy, and then the second one, I'm not sure whether it's for Terry or Mandy. We'll see which one of you, or maybe both, want to jump in. So one question that's come in is about the use of drop boxes for ballots in the state, and why the state has limited the number of drop boxes. Some mention of Cuyahoga County having only one, obviously a very populous county, and why not do them more proportionally to the population of the state?
Sure. So as someone that put their right hand up and testified in federal court at 9 p.m. from my kitchen, that was really weird. COVID has done weird things to the legal system. I am intimately aware of this. And so I just want to correct you, Dean Davies, if you will oblige me. We in no way limited drop boxes, we expanded them. So drop boxes in the state of Ohio never existed in state law, ever. Until House Bill 197, which was the General Assembly's COVID relief bill. And so there's a lot of misinformation and frankly, disinformation out there about drop boxes. So I just want to set the record straight now on the legal process and what the facts are. So 197 was passed, and it was what in the crisis of post-March 2020, it was the General Assembly's response to COVID and the election. And it set forth the rules for how we were going to conclude the March primary that was ultimately concluded on April 28th, 2020. As you will know, it converted the March 17th primary into a virtual all vote by mail primary. There were two groups of individuals that were permitted to vote in person on April 28th, and that was the homeless and the disabled. And so within that bill, it also set forth drop boxes, and it was one drop box outside each Board of Elections for that period of time. All of that law was temporary law. So it expired after the April 28th primary election. So that law is no longer on the books. But of course, boards still have this drop box that that House Bill 197 required them to have. And so the secretary, if you go through Title 35, which I'm sure Terry can talk about as well. I mean, it is with all due respect, it is a disaster, right? Like I'm not here to defend Title 35 by any stretch of the imagination, and Secretary LaRose would tell you the same thing. We've tried to change it many times, but we're not the legislature, right? We are a completely different branch of government. We're the executive branch, and so we don't make the laws; we execute them. And so, the absentee return laws in the state of Ohio are very strict, and it's a shall, not a may. And it tells you exactly where that ballot needs to be returned, and it is to the Board of Elections, to the director. Personally deliver it to the director. And so, I'm not going to bore you with the entire, legal analysis that was obviously litigated, and we were ultimately successful at the Sixth Circuit, the United States Sixth Circuit. But this isn't about, drop boxes and whether or not there should be more or less, it's about the legislature setting the rules. I think Professor Enns set that forth, previously in her remarks, that there absolutely needs to be a public debate in the legislature about these issues that can improve Ohio's election laws. And Secretary LaRose has been, very supportive of all of those conversations continuously. And we were very involved in many of the conversations before, after the primary election. So, we're not the legislature. We can, lobby the legislature and say, this is what we think is good election law. But we in no way limited drop boxes. We expanded it. We kept something that was in temporary law in place. And then we furthermore, via directive, said a Board of Elections can have 20 drop boxes at the Board of Elections, right? There was an unfounded, what we discovered was an unfounded concern. We actually have photographs of Cuyahoga County Board of Elections drop box at the close of polls and throughout the day. There was never a line. So, I think there was a narrative that was driven politically to drive into something that just wasn't reality. But we expanded it to say each board can have 20 drop boxes outside their Board of Elections if there are concerns about lines. They can also have staffed drop-offs. So bipartisan team under certain requirements. This was Directive 2020-22 that we issued. So there were two directives, 2020-16 and 2020-22, that set the rules for the boards on these issues. And the manned drop-offs, bipartisan teams, same thing, outside the Board of Elections. If you didn't even want to leave your car, you could just drop it into these teams that would, take it directly to the Board of Elections that was just a few feet away. So we expanded that. None of that had ever existed in election administration previously in 88 county boards of elections.
Great, thank you. Okay, so one more question coming in from the audience before we turn back to the sort of ongoing litigation and some of the challenges to the presidential election. Looking forward, both for Terry and Mandy, whichever one of you'd like to chime in, what's the possibility of moving to a system of all online voting, or at least universal online availability? Some states have broader availability in terms of online voting than others. What might that look like? What are some of the concerns? How realistic is it?
I'll start, and I'm sure Mandy has thoughts. At this point, there is not a lot of online voting, a lot because in the United States, we have secret ballots. And in order to be able to assure that someone only votes once, and in order for that voter to be certain that her vote was counted, you would have to be able to identify more closely the voter and the vote. And we don't do that in this country. When people say, well, we can go and do our banking with an ATM, well, like, yeah, that's because you get a receipt with your name and your account number and the amount you just put in, which is really not what you want a printout of for your vote. So I think it's still a long ways off. That doesn't even mention hacking, internet security, and those questions. I think, and Steve and Ned know the answer, and Mandy probably does more, about how the military piece works, where I think there's a little bit of an exception on how online voting works for military voters. But in general, because we disaggregate the voter from the vote itself, doing it electronically is really tricky.
Yeah, so I can talk about this. Obviously, another lawsuit. So I'm intimately aware of, everything surrounding this. So when we say voting, we really need to break that down. What do we mean by voting? Do we mean returning a marked ballot? Is that what we mean as voting, as, the action, the verb? Or do we mean requesting an absentee ballot? Like, what do we mean by voting, right? So we first need to understand that. So let's say that we mean returning a marked ballot. That is expressly prohibited in Ohio law. You cannot return a marked ballot electronically in the state of Ohio, regardless. So even UOCAVA voters have to return the ballot. Now the application section is much different. So UOCAVA voters can have a variety of ways to request an absentee ballot, and then they can receive the ballot electronically. They just can't return it electronically. So I do want to make that clarification as it pertains to Ohio law. For regular voters, we do not have online absentee ballot applications right now. That's one of our biggest legislative priorities, is to get that changed, because it's something the secretary has been very passionate about, is that we have online voter registration. We should absolutely have online absentee ballot applications. But unless there's a law change as it pertains to the prohibition against returning a marked ballot electronically, I don't see that changing. I think in the era of Russia, Iran, and the foreign influence and interference that we see on a daily basis, as far as chatter and noise, I am skeptical that the legislature would be in a position to take that up, or that there would be the controls in place at this given time to make sure that that's absolutely fail safe and fail proof, because voting equipment, even in the state of Ohio, voting machines are never connected to the internet. There's a full air gap. And so there would be a lot of technological conversations that had to be had, before that's a thing. But our good friends in West Virginia, Secretary Warner, and a couple other states have experimented with it as far as UOCAVA ballots go, with blockchain. I think a couple years ago. So there are some studies out there, and I know people are interested in it. But as far as the state of Ohio goes, that would require a law change and a lot of other conversations.
All right, terrific. So I'm just watching the clock. I see we have about 5 minutes left. I want to turn back to you, Steve, with a couple of questions about the ongoing lawsuits, and then I've got a couple more just at the end for Ned. So want to make sure we fit this all in. I know people are really interested in some of the outcome of all this. So the question for you, Steve, twofold. One is, what's the timing we should expect on the resolution of the lawsuits that are being filed to challenge the presidential election results at the state level? And then secondly, what in particular about the Pennsylvania lawsuit and questions about ballots that are coming in late, might that have implications for other ballots that have been received, or does that lawsuit in Pennsylvania apply only to those ballots coming in after Election Day?
So very quickly, I think the litigation currently going on will conclude relatively quickly. The states have their own timetables for certifying their election results. It varies from state to state. There are a few states that have already produced certified totals, but most states do it in the period that's 2 to 3 weeks after Election Day, and they will want to do their best to meet those regular deadlines and to not let the court actions delay that, or very much anyway. And I think courts will be sympathetic to wanting the states to complete that, so that the states will have their presidential electors in place by December 8th, ideally. I mean, presidential electors are required to cast their votes on December 14th. But they are targeting December 8th because they get an added measure of protection when they do that. So relatively quickly, in terms of there's one Pennsylvania lawsuit that actually raises a really interesting an important question of the overlay of the US Constitution on the way in which states arrange for their elections to be conducted. And it has to do, as you observed, Dean, with a small number of ballots in Pennsylvania that under a Pennsylvania State Supreme Court decision have been allowed to arrive in the 3 days after Election Day, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of last week. Those ballots have been segregated and not yet included in the count. And my understanding is that the quantity of those ballots is simply not enough to make a difference to the outcome in any event. The underlying issue is whether the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision to extend the deadline for their return entrenched upon the legislature's authority to set the terms of the election. If that claim were to succeed, I saw in the question there was a broader question of whether it would undermine other dimensions of the Pennsylvania election process or of other states' election processes. I don't think it would undermine the entire Pennsylvania election this year if that claim were to succeed. It would affect potentially some other court adjustments to election processes in other places. And it would be very interesting going forward to know that that's the way the US Supreme Court construes the provision in the US Constitution. But the final point I would make is that even if that case got back to the US Supreme Court, which I think is incredibly unlikely this election, the court might well announce its own interpretation of the US Constitution's impact here as a prospective ruling and leave the laws that were on the books as of this year's election day in place for this year's election, because the voters had a justifiable basis to rely on the law as of that moment.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so Ned, I'm going to turn to you for the last question. I'm going to ask you to put on your NBC TV hat because I'm going to give you a really hard question and not much time to answer. There's about 1 minute left in our program today. 3 different strands coming in of questions. One is about the large number of some voters out there that believe there is fraud and what that might mean for the legitimacy of the election going forward. Another is what happens if states overturn results from the election in their states, the state legislatures. And then finally, what if President Trump won't leave the White House?
So real quick, thank you. So the last one I'm not worried about. And in fact, as I said in the Washington Post, we will have President Biden sworn into office on January 20th. That's not, whether you voted for him or against him, that is the reality of the situation. And that's based in part on just counting votes in the US Senate. And, you can read the piece in the Post to go into the details, but that's just, I think where the numbers are and the truth of the matter lies. So that's the basic, that's just the basics. The first part of your question was, what about this sense of legitimacy? And what about all the voters who somehow don't feel that that is the authentic result? That is something that we are really going to have to work on. We're not going to solve that problem between now and January 20th, or even February 20th or March 20th. But maybe in the next 4 years, we can repair this sense of fair play and this sense that we're all in this together. I hope actually we start to work on that even before December 14th. I mean, the more there is an attack on the result that is not based on evidence, that's based on the kind of disinformation that Mandy talked about, the more corrosive that is. I don't know whether it's 10% of the public or 20% of the public that might believe that disinformation, but whatever the percentage is, it's not good, it's not healthy. Obviously, the higher the number, the harder it is to run a majority rule society. But so we've got to figure out a way that the party, and obviously, I'm not counting on the candidates alone to do this. I think the parties as parties have to step up here. So I think the national leadership of both parties have to do some soul searching. And that's going to take some time. So, yep, we're going to have an answer. The system's going to work in terms of its basic architecture, but culturally, some soul searching for sure.
All right, thanks so much. And like any great discussion, it's always with regret, but also excitement that we come to an end, excitement reflecting on how wonderful this conversation has been. And I can feel the gears in my head whirring. I'm sure it is for many of the members of the audience too. And, you know, I think as Steve Huffner would point out with respect to how we move forward, one of the things, of course, is an incredibly important role for both lawyers and law students to help educate the public and to continue to build and nurture the rule of law in our society. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this 2020 elections reflection. I want to thank our panelists who've just been delightful and incredibly engaging. Ned Foley, Steve Huffner, Terry Enns, and our special guest, Mandy Grandjean. In addition, I want to thank all of the alums, faculty, staff, students, and friends of the college who participated in our continuing education series, Discussions from Drinko Hall, these past 6 months. I encourage you to be on the lookout in 2021 for additional programming. We hope to continue to utilize these webinars as a way for you to stay connected to the college as you continue your lifelong learning journey. Until next time, on behalf of the entire college, I wish you and your loved ones a safe and happy holiday season. Thank you, and go Bucks.